Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be wrapping up the books that I read in May. Now, I've read 18 books in May, which is quite a lot, so in this video I'll focus on the fantasy books that I read, and then I'll do another one where I cover the science fiction and like the children's picture books that I read. As usual, I am going to do this book battle style, which means I pair up all the books, I battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. So in this video we'll figure out the best fantasy book of the month, and then in the next one we'll put that one up against all the other ones. But anyway, let's get into talking about the books. First up, I've got a couple of books that are both kind of based around paranormal investigation companies. So we've got White Hot by Ilona Andrews up against Proven Guilty by Jim Butcher. So White Hot is the second book in the Hidden Legacy series by Ilona Andrews. Primarily in this series we're following this family that runs this paranormal investigation company. The first three books are Nevada's trilogy, so Nevada's the older sister, and she's really the one working the hardest to keep this company going and keep the family afloat. Now, in this world, certain people have these amazing psychic abilities, and these do run in families. So there are certain families that are very powerful, both magically and politically. For the most part, Nevada's family has tried to avoid all that kind of stuff, but in the first book and the second book, they end up being involved in these investigations with these big, powerful families, which also brings attention on their own powers that they have. So Nevada's power is that she can tell whether people are telling the truth, which obviously running a paranormal investigations company is very useful. I put off reading this series for a long time just because the covers are the worst. There definitely is a romance element to these stories, but it's a very small part. There was more in the second book than in the first book, but still, like, it's a small part. You can skip over it if you don't like it, and it's definitely not the focus of the story, like the cover might have you believe. And really I should have known that I would love this series because the Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews is one of my favorite series, and I feel like this one's very similar in that it's got a similar writing style and a very similar sense of humor. It's also very similar in that the men are very kind of alpha male, but our main character doesn't really put up with much of that shit. As well, there's really a focus on relationships, so there's a great family dynamic between all of Nevada's family, and she's now also building these other relationships with these different magical families. I do think sometimes the investigations can be a little bit info dumpy, but it's not done in a way that annoys me. Sometimes info dumping annoys me, but in these ones I feel like it's just giving you the information you need to know to understand how Nevada's doing the investigation. So I'm excited to read the last book in Nevada's trilogy, and then I'll start on Catalina's trilogy. Actually, the third book in Catalina's trilogy is coming out later in the year, so I might try and binge read that trilogy all at once. But I would definitely say if you've liked Ilona Andrews stuff in the past, or you've heard about this series and you think it's interesting, don't be put off by the covers. The other book in this battle is Proven Guilty by Jim Butcher. This is, I think, the 8th book in the Harry Dresden files. So Harry Dresden is a wizard and also a private investigator. He's always getting involved in helping out different people with different problems. But there's also kind of a bigger world, and it's the bigger world that I really enjoy, and I like getting more and more of that. There is a war going on between the different kinds of vampires and the Wizard Council, and there's also the Fae all involved in that as well. In this particular one, Harry Dresden gets pulled in to help his friend's teenage daughter. She has been at SlasherCon, which is this horror film festival, and some of these horror monsters have started turning up and killing people, which is not ideal. So she asks him for help. Now, if you've heard me talk about the Harry Dresden series before, or in fact if you've heard other people talk about it before as well, you might know, Harry is kind of a dick. He has this idea that he needs to protect all women, and that women are these like beautiful, amazing creatures, and he sexualizes them even when he's in the middle of life and death situations. I do feel like maybe he tried to tone it down a little bit more in this book, but I really didn't appreciate when he was talking about how sexy these teenage girls were. Like, he would say, oh no, I mustn't think about how sexy these teenage girls are with their short skirts and their ample bosoms, and like, no, but you're thinking about it, and like, you don't need to tell me about it. I honestly don't want to know. And really, if you're going to be thinking stuff like this, you just shouldn't be around teenage girls. Can you just not? And so when there's this mother who doesn't think that Harry should be around his teenage daughter, and I was like, you are correct. He should not. And I'm a little bit worried because there is kind of this storyline where one of these teenage girls has a crush on Harry, and that teenage girl is probably going to be around in future books. And is that going to end up really annoying me? I think it's going to end up really annoying me. But if I can just like ignore that whole part of Harry's personality, I do enjoy the mysteries in these stories as well. And this one again pulled in a lot of things from the bigger world and progressed those relationships. There's kind of a theme throughout this where Harry, when he was younger, did some dark magic, not really understanding the consequences of it because he was young and untrained. And the Wizards Council is very harsh on people in that situation, like they're evil, kill them, is the Wizard Council's reaction to it. And Harry's trying to fight back and say, no, you shouldn't just write people off as evil when they've done one bad thing that they didn't even really understand. And I do enjoy that theme within the story. Also, my favorite thing actually in the Harry Dresden series is Mouse, the dog. If anything bad ever happens to Mouse, I'm just going to be really mad. In fact, Mouse got slightly hurt in this one and I was not happy about it. I just want Mouse to save the day. In fact, maybe we could make it a Mouse story and not have Harry. Because that would be better, wouldn't it be better? Anyway, if I am putting these two books up against each other, which I am going to put White Hot through just because the characters are so much more relatable and likable, and I'm much more invested in what's going to happen with those characters than I am with Harry. Okay, then our next battle is going to be between two books from the same series. We've got House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas up against House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J Maas. So these are the first and second books in the Crescent Cities series. This is kind of like an urban fantasy or a fantasy world, but there's all this modern technology as well as shapeshifters and the Fae and angels and these kind of magical creatures that rule over everyone. So in the first book, we primarily follow Bryce, who's this party girl, but right at the beginning, some crazy things happen and she ends up getting pulled into this murder investigation. And she has to work with this angel, Hunt. Hunt was part of this rebellion which tried to break free of the leading magical people. And as a result, he's now a slave and has to kill people in order to eventually, in potentially thousands of years, win his freedom. Hunt doesn't think much of Bryce, just thinks she's a stupid party girl, but as she proves otherwise, slowly a romance develops. Now, I'm not particularly a big Sarah J Maas fan. I read the Court of Thorns and Roses series. No, I read the first two books and then I thought, this is not for me, I need to stop. I read all of, what's the series called? I want to say Game of Thrones, but that's not right. Anyway, whatever that other series is called with 7 books, I read all of that and I liked it less and less as we went on because, again, just not really for me. Sarah J Maas has this tendency to do this thing where the main character will know something and the reveal will be you finding out that they knew something all along and that they've done all these things without telling you, even though it's very frustrating because you've been following along with them, so you expect to know everything that they know. And she did this in House of Earth and Blood, and the first time I was very frustrated with it. However, this was a reread, and I have to say on a reread, I understand it a lot more. I feel like every time it would have made sense for the character to tell you one of these things, there was a reason why they didn't. And I almost think like knowing all these twists and turns and reveals that were going to happen made my reading experience on the second time much more enjoyable. Every time the characters were thinking this thing and I knew it was actually this other thing, I felt really happy. I was having a lot of fun. Bryce is a really fun character, and all the other characters and the relationships around her were also really satisfying to read about. The only thing I would say is on a reread, I did find the ending less impactful, but I think that's just that on the first time, so many surprises were happening. It just felt like it was escalating and escalating, but of course on the second time, those things weren't so surprising, and so I didn't get that same escalation experience. But overall, I still really enjoyed my reread, and I was very worried for the second book, which was honestly the right way to go into it, because the second book was just a mess, in my opinion. It didn't really feel like it had a plot. It felt like it had about 100 subplots that were all going on. We got bits and pieces of all these different characters' perspectives, and it was hard to know what was even important. A lot of like mucking around relationship stuff, or at least relationships being built that I don't care about. Some absolutely ridiculous sex scenes, which of course is to be expected with Sarah J Maas, but I was hoping that we didn't get too much in the first book, so maybe we wouldn't get too much in the second book, but we got a lot in the second book. As well, in the first book, Bryce is set up to actually be very smart despite her party girl attitude, and I really liked the fact that she could be a party girl and out to have a lot of fun as well as being very intelligent. In the second book, she was just dumb. And even the things she did where everyone else was like, oh, so smart, they really weren't that smart. They were just annoying. And as well, in this one, we learn a lot more about Bryce's best friend Danica's secrets. And it just doesn't make sense that Danica would have that many secrets and not tell her best friend about them. So that was very annoying. And going into this, I'd heard people say the ending was mind-blowing. Something happened at the end that people were very excited about. I didn't know what it was going to be. And briefly, I thought it was going to be one thing, which I thought, well, it might be okay. Maybe I'll continue if it's that thing. It wasn't that thing. Something else happened, and honestly, my feelings about the series now is I don't give a fuck. I am not going to continue. I don't think I'm going to continue, which is so terrible because I love that first book so much. But I just have no interest in the direction that the third book is going to go in, I assume. The element that was introduced at the end, I don't care. I don't want it. And maybe I would be willing to put up with that element if there had been a clear direction through the rest of the story, but honestly, I didn't care about any of the subplots either, and there's just so many of them that now I don't care. Basically, I don't care. So, if we are putting these two books up against each other, clearly House of Earth and Blood is going to go through to the next round, and we're just going to try and pretend that House of Sky and Breath never happened. I know some people liked it, but honestly, it just was not for me, which, like, I always knew Sarah J. Maas was not an author that was really for me or writing in the style that I would like, but I liked House of Earth and Blood so much that I thought maybe this series would be for me. Because it was Sarah J. Maas's like first fully adult series. But no, not for me. Okay, then our next battle. I'm grouping these two books together just because they had some similar names between the two books. So firstly, we've got The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan up against The Excalibur Curse by Kiersten White. So The Fires of Heaven, I've just been trying to think like what number it is in the Wheel of Time. I want to say it's the 5th book. I'll correct myself if I'm wrong. I think it's the 5th book in the Wheel of Time series. So the Wheel of Time series is hard to describe what it's about, even though it's kind of about nothing. It has this idea of circular time, and we're following a bunch of young adults who have been pulled into this prophecy. The idea is that there's this dark one that is always lurking around, but he's been imprisoned, and regularly these people will come back into the world and he will have a chance at freedom. And there's a whole bunch of people kind of conspiring to either make the prophecy happen or make it not happen, or at least trying to make certain events repeat. Honestly, it spends a lot of time on stuff that I don't care about and not enough time explaining the circular time stuff. Also not enough time spent in dreams, which there's a part where people can like communicate through dreams and kind of live almost through dreams. That part I also really love. But in this particular book, it was the girls were mostly off like in the circus hiding, and I didn't care about most of that. As well, Rand, who's like the one that we think is the chosen one, he's just doing this thing where girls are falling in love with him. Like all the girls are like, he's the one I'm meant to be with. And I don't understand because Rand is so boring. I don't understand why any girl would want to be with him. He's struggling with the expectations that are put on him because of this prophecy, and there's things he wants to do as part of fulfilling the prophecy and other things he wants to try and avoid. There are these other people who kind of know more about the circular time stuff, and I would love to get some more of those people who've kind of lived in previous revolutions. And I do think as the series goes on that we'll get more of that, and I think I will like that, but it's just a very slow series, and so I tend to like the very end of the books, but feel like most of the content of the books is just filler almost. And these are very long books, so you'll kind of expect that you would get more content within them, or that more would happen to progress the plot. But anyway, at this point, I'm going to continue. I'm going to read the whole series just to see, because I know so many people love this series, and there are elements that I like. It's just that there's not enough of those elements. But also, how I link this into the next book, there are some characters within the Wheel of Time who have Arthurian-inspired names. And in fact, Nynaeve, who's one of the characters that, I used to think was one of my favorites, but more and more I like her less. Anyway, I didn't realize that Nynaeve is an Arthurian-inspired name, but then I was reading the Excalibur Curse, which is like an Arthurian retelling, and I came across this character called Nynaeve, and I was like, oh, so it's not just the royal family from Wheel of Time that have these Arthurian names. There's more to it. And I really do wish I knew more about the Arthur legend. In fact, reading the Camelot Rising series have made me even more interested in learning a bit more about that at some point. So yeah, the Excalibur Curse is the third and final book in the Camelot Rising series, which is a retelling of the Arthur and Camelot myth, except that there's a few gender-bent characters, and as well, Guinevere is not Guinevere, she's a changeling. Now, I read the first book and I was a little bit uncertain about it. I kind of decided that I wouldn't continue with the series. However, then I saw the audiobook for the second book was available at the library, and I thought, why not? I always have lots of time for listening to audiobooks, so it doesn't really hurt if I pick up one and I don't enjoy it so much. And actually, that second book made me interested in continuing the series. In this one, Guinevere meets up with Guinevere's sister. Of course, it's not actually her sister, and things get very awkward, and I really liked what we learned about the world in that one. In this last book, Guinevere's been captured and taken away from Camelot, but also left some protection in place for Camelot, and she's having to deal with Morgan Le Fay and Merlin and what their magic has done. And I really liked it. The only thing I will say is all the time Guinevere was like trying to do the right thing, and she'd be so convinced that she's figured everything out and she knows what the right thing is and she's going to do the right thing, even though to do the right thing she has to betray her friends. So I really liked like the moral conflict that she would have about like, well, I think this is the right thing so I have to do it, but also I feel bad about hurting my friend. But do you know what? So many times this thing that she was so convinced was the right thing was not the right thing, and that did get a little bit annoying, especially just like how upset she would be about it. But it wasn't unbelievable that she would be that upset, and I did really like all the different relationships, especially there's quite a few female friendships. The one I loved the most was there's this Pictish princess called Finna, I think, and I just love Finna. She's just very upfront about things, and just very quickly decides to be on Guinevere's side, even though she's meant to not be on her side. So, like, I guess you could say it's not necessarily a very realistic story, but I still found it a lot of fun. I really liked the dream magic, which is another thing it has in common with the Wheel of Time. And I do think maybe with all the elements that were in the story, more could have been done with it, and it could have been actually really amazing, but still I was satisfied with what we did get. Well, for the most part, there's one thing that I think kind of ruined everything, and that is that there is kind of a sapphic relationship hinted at throughout this whole series, and that never came to fruition, which to me felt a little bit like queerbaiting, especially knowing the larger Camelot myth. Although, as I said, I don't know it as well as I would like to, so maybe if I learnt more about the myth, I'd decide that what happened made sense. But honestly, I just wanted certain characters to kiss and be happy together, and they didn't, and that was annoying. So, yeah. But if I'm putting these two books up against each other, I still would say that I'm going to put the Excalibur Curse through to the next round, just because for 95% of the Wheel of Time I was bored and wondering what the point of anything was, whereas the Excalibur Curse had some nice twists and turns, it had some genuine emotional moments, and I could just pretend that the sapphic relationship happened at the end, you know? I don't need it to actually happen in the book, I'll just pretend. It gave me the foundation, I'll make up my own ending. So, Excalibur Curse through to the next round. Okay, I've got 3 books left. They don't really go together, except that these are more fantasies that are based more in the real world. So we'll start with Succulents and Spells by Andi C. Buchanan, up against Where the Drowned Girls Go by Seanan McGuire. So, Succulents and Spells is the first book in a little trilogy. The book is actually very tiny. I don't have it here, but it's only 90 pages. And that's probably my biggest criticism, is that I would have liked to get more of it. However, there's 2 more books, so I will be getting more of it at some point. Although, frustratingly, only the first and third books are available in paperback, and then the middle book is only available in ebook. but I'm sure I'll manage anyway. This is a book set in New Zealand, which I was super excited about because if you don't know, I'm from New Zealand, and there's just something about reading a book written by someone from your own country, and it's set in your own country, and it has all those things that are so recognizable, like just locations and certain mindsets and politics and systems and shops, and it's just really nice to have all of that stuff being understandable and feeling like relatable and something that I have to deal with in everyday life rather than like all this stuff from the UK or from America. It's just, I don't know what you guys are talking about sometimes, you know? So in this one, we're following this witch who hasn't yet worked out what her specialty is, and this other girl turns up at her doorstep and says, hey, I'd really like to take some biological samples of the monster that lives under your floor because I'm trying to do a study about monsters. And she's like, well, you know, you'd have to ask the monster if it's okay with him. If it's okay with him, then I don't mind. And just the way that it talks about magic in such a like normal way, as if it really is just a thing that happens. So this other woman is autistic, and this is an Own Voices story because Andi C. Buchanan is autistic themselves. And as well, actually, Andi C. Buchanan is non-binary, and there was quite a nice bit where when the characters first meet each other, they just let each other know their pronouns, and it was all done very naturally. So it's just like all these things incorporated into the story in such a natural way. I really liked it. There is a little bit of a romantic element, and as well, this other girl is not a witch, but she comes from a witch family, but she doesn't have any powers herself. When the other girl goes to her house just to visit, kind of discovers this magical mystery about her family, and they have to figure that out. Definitely there's a really strong theme throughout the story about finding who you are or what you want to be. It's kind of a new adult story where we've got a bunch of people who are all, you know, at that age where you're studying, just starting work, trying to figure out what do you even want to try and do with your life. It was very cozy, very enjoyable, and I liked it a lot. As I said, I just wish it had been a bit longer because I think there's some really interesting ideas that I would love to see explored more. So I'll be interested to see whether they actually do get explored more in the next book. Then we've got Where the Drowned Girls Go by Seanan McGuire. This is the 7th book in the Wayward Children series, which is a series all about these children who found these magical doors through to magical worlds, like Narnia type things. But then for whatever reason, they've ended up back in the real world and they're having to get used to living a normal kind of life, but also hoping that one day they'll find their doors again and be able to go back home. And the Home for Wayward Children is basically this boarding school where these children can go and they won't feel so alone because they'll be around people who also believe in these magical worlds and understand what the experience is like. So in the 5th book, they do end up going kind of on a quest back to one of these magical worlds, and one of the girls has a bit of a traumatic experience, and as a result she decides that she's going to go to this other school. And at this other school, they don't try to like prepare you to try and find your door again. Instead, they try to prepare you to go back to the real world and like forget that there was magic in the world ever. Just forget everything. But some of their strategies for making people forget everything are somewhat questionable and not particularly nice. But she goes there and she's fairly committed to the process regardless. I guess I don't want to say much more because these books, again, are very short and so not much really happens in them. And this is another one where there were some elements of the story that I found really interesting, but I would really love to see them unpacked more and explored more. And it is true that throughout the series you get more and more slowly. But I do just feel like we're going to get to the end of the series. I don't know when. I think she's planned out like the first 10 books. So maybe there's a few more. But I just feel like we never get enough of what I would like to get. And while in some of the earlier books I felt like they were very strongly themed and I really liked the writing style and the way it was analysing like societal norms, I do feel like the later books have been weaker in that and like less focused. And that lack of focus kind of means we get less deep into whatever this book is focusing on, if you know what I mean. Also in this one of the themes is fat phobia and body positivity. And I wasn't 100% on board with the way that it was addressing the issue. Like, I do think that people don't deserve to be judged for being fat, that health and weight are very complex things and you can't possibly know what's going on with another person, so you should just leave it up to them because they can probably sort it out themselves, or at least they know more than you about their own issues. But I did feel like this book made out like Cora, our main character, who is fat, only deserved not to be judged because she was in fact very healthy physically and ate all the right stuff. But honestly, even if people are unhealthy and unfit, they don't deserve your judgment about being fat. So this is just one of these things where I felt like there was an issue being addressed, but there's a lot more depth to that issue that it couldn't really get into because there isn't enough space in the book to get into any of that. And I'm remembering also there's another bit where it almost seems like it's condoning murder and it doesn't really explain enough, I thought, about when murder would be okay, i.e. not very often. But as far as the series goes, I thought this book was pretty good. Not one of my favorites of the series, but not one of the ones that I disliked either. It was pretty solid. There were some elements I really liked. Sure, some elements that frustrated me, but overall, I think if you like this series, this particular installment is a fine one. So, if I'm putting this up against Succulents and Spells, it's a little bit hard because both of these had elements I really liked, but also didn't really explore any of those things well enough. But I think I'm going to put Succulents and Spells through to the next round just because I really love that New Zealand feel, and there was something very cozy and satisfying about reading that book. Then I've only got one more book, so we'll put it up against the winner of the last battle. So we've got Succulents and Spells by Andi C. Buchanan up against Dark Days by Derek Landy. So Dark Days is the fifth book? Wow, I'm really bad at keeping track of what number of series I'm up to now. It's because I've been trying to do series 0, trying to catch up on all the series that I'm reading, and so I've been reading so many series and it's very hard to keep track of them all. But anyway, whatever number it is, in Skulls Are Very Pleasant, this series is just a lot of fun. We're following this girl named Stephanie whose writer uncle dies and leaves this house to her, and as a result she ends up getting pulled into this magical world that she discovers her uncle was involved in, and as well she ends up getting this skeleton man, Skulls Are Very Pleasant, as her mentor, and he's kind of teaching her how to be like a paranormal detective. As well, there are some big things happening in the magical world that are kind of putting the whole world at risk, and Stephanie's trying to help out with that. This particular book didn't exactly focus on the thing that I thought it was going to focus on. My criticism of this series is definitely that there are a whole bunch of villains and I can never keep track of who's who, and I don't know if it's just because I'm stupid or because I'm listening to the audiobook, which makes it harder to keep track, or like it actually is confusing. But it feels like all the bad guys have names beginning with S or V, and like they're all just trying to do bad things, so I don't know how I'm supposed to keep track of them all. But they were all getting together actually in this one trying to do some bad things, but they weren't very good at working together, so that was kind of fun. I do really like the humor in this. There are definitely parts of the story where I will be laughing out loud, but there's also parts where it is a little bit silly. As well, there's an element in this where Stephanie is kind of the chosen one in multiple different ways, and I haven't decided if I like that or not yet. I'm kind of reserving judgment until we get to the end of the series. I have heard the series is kind of made up of 2 story arcs, and I think the first one is just the first 7 books, so I'm getting close to the end of that one, and I might even manage to finish it in June. I do think just because this is such a long series, at some point I'm going to do a push to just try and catch up on it, because otherwise I think I'm going to feel like it's going on and on a bit too much. And given that I mostly just find this like a fun series, it's not something that I want to go on and on. And I have to say, I've never really felt any of the particular plot lines from individual books stick with me from this series. Like, there's particular characters that stick with me and particular like jokes that stick with me, but the plot, not so much. And I think that's just because every time the villains are trying to do stuff, but there's a million of them and I can't keep track of them. Again, I don't know, am I just dumb? Maybe. But anyway, if we are putting this up against Succulents and Spells, I knew what was going on in Succulents and Spells, and the villains were very clear. So I'm going to put Succulents and Spells through to the next round, which is going to be the semi-finals. So let's start trying to work out what the best fantasy book I read this month was. Firstly, we're going to be putting White Hot by Ilona Andrews up against House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. It annoys me a lot that I know that the Hidden Legacy series is going to be a series that I love much more than I love the Crescent City series. However, if we're looking at individual books, I just really loved House of Earth and Blood. I had so many hopes. I really do think, like in terms of world and characters and plot, that House of Earth and Blood was better than White Hot. Now, long-term plot of the series, Hidden Legacy will totally win. But we're only talking about House of Earth and Blood here, so House of Earth and Blood is going to go through to the next round. But honestly, can I recommend it? I don't know if I can because I hated the next book. So annoying. Anyway, then our next battle is going to be between the Excalibur Curse by Kiersten White and Succulents and Spells by Andi C. Buchanan. And this is one where I don't know. They're not really the same. If Succulents and Spells had been longer, definitely Succulents and Spells would win. But it wasn't. It was shorter. Okay, I don't know. My brain doesn't work today. So what I'm going to do is go with the Excalibur Curse because I think it was a really good way to conclude the series, even though, oh yeah, now I'm remembering the whole queer baiting thing. If that had just gone different, I would feel so much better about the series. Okay, you know what? I'm going to go with Succulents and Spells because it delivered on the sapphic relationship that I wanted. So we'll put Succulents and Spells through to the final, and that means for the final, we're going to have House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas up against Succulents and Spells by Andi C. Buchanan. And honestly, this is depressing because I know the answer. The answer is House of Earth and Blood. Maybe I shouldn't let rereads win the battle, but honestly, it was the best book I read this month. I'm just so annoyed that House of Sky and Breath didn't live up to that setup. Maybe I can just pretend House of Earth and Blood was a standalone? Honestly, another book that I read this month was Children of June, and in that one of the children is able to basically convince themselves that another character is dead, even though they know they're not. And I wish that I was that good at convincing myself of lies. Maybe I'll try and develop that power. Maybe it's a magical power that I could actually have, telling myself lies. Is that a power I want? I don't know. Anyway, House of Earth and Blood, best book I read this month. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I read this month, what you thought about them, because I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments. And I will also have another video wrapping up my science fiction and children's books, which I will link when it exists. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.